Today we're talking to Jen and Lauren, two women who met, became instant friends, and within a matter of months started the journey of surrogacy together. This topic has always been a bit of a mystery to me and something I really wasn't able to wrap my mind around, right? Until I heard their story. And I had so many questions from when do you decide that surrogacy is the way to go? And how do you decide to carry a child for someone else? And then just so many more. And Jen and Lauren, they don't hold anything back in this interview. And they talk so candidly about all of the details and all of the feelings that come along with this journey. So today's episode will be the first part of two. If you've ever thought about becoming a surrogate or using a surrogate, or you had any judgments about people that are surrogates, I highly recommend that you hear their story. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are. Like I said, I have my friends Jen and Lauren, and we are about to get into something I actually didn't really know a lot about until I got on the phone with Jen one day and she started telling me her story. And it just was like, what the holy cow? Things you never think about with surrogacy, but when you start hearing about it, it's like, I need to hear about this. And I know I had told Jen, like back in my college days, in my broke student days, there were the ads in the school newspaper because you read the newspaper back then. And it was like egg donors or surrogates. And there was this part of me where I was like, ooh, hey, I could use the money. But then I didn't really know much more about it. So I just, went the other way. And so to actually hear this experience, I think is amazing because Lauren, I understand the in vitro journey with you because I've been there, done that, but you definitely, had a much longer time with that. So what I really want from this is for people to understand what is it like, first of all, to A, realize that this is the route that you have to go down, B, realize you're willing to be that person to help someone else out, and then how does it all come together? Because I know people, if they hear about it, just so many questions come to mind because they don't understand it. So, Lauren, if you don't mind, let's start with you. So can you tell us a little bit about what your journey was like before you went to surrogacy?
Okay, so I'll make it short. I actually am good at doing this because I tell my students this story, and it all leads to why it's so important to pay attention to who you meet in college or who you meet anywhere, really. But so I started with exploring infertility problems when I was about 34. I had been married at 32 and we had been trying for a year, and my now ex-husband was like, something's wrong, something's wrong. And I was kind of the personality where I was like, I don't want to face that right now. No, everything's fine. So finally, I saw a doctor, and I live in Orlando. And so our first clinic was in Orlando. We did 6 IVF cycles. Once they took all my stats, they were like, things don't look good. We bypassed IUI altogether and went straight to IVF, and we did 6 cycles with them total. The first 3, after those failed, my doctor there said, okay, you need a donor. Like, there's something wrong with your eggs. So then we worked on that. We found a donor here in Orlando. Actually, I'm sorry. It was a donor that was through the Orlando clinic, but it was not a fresh donor. It was a frozen egg donor. And that was kind of a disaster. I'll just leave it at that. I'd be happy to expand on that another time. And then after that, that's when I think we did one cycle more with that donor, with those eggs. And at that point, it's a long story, but at that point we decided that the expertise of the Orlando clinic could not handle my problems. I have nothing against the doctor. He did everything he could. I think he had great ideas, but they just couldn't execute those ideas. So
I want to rewind back a little bit really quickly before you go on. What is it like to choose an egg donor for you? Because this is, you've put so much time and so much investment, so much heartache, and your body goes through so much in that in vitro process, especially 6 times. And then to finally be like, I got to choose another woman's eggs to be the biological donor to my child. How do you choose that? What's that process like?
Well, so I think it's a great question. And I will just kind of sum it up because I went through this process twice. So the first
Mm.
egg donor was not a good selection. The second egg donor was amazing. But they were under two different criteria. The first one was frozen. The second one was fresh. They also are very different costs. Frozen
Mm.
eggs are a lot cheaper than a fresh egg donor. So we went the cheaper route the first time because we had already spent so much money at that point. And so I based my choice on trait characteristics, physical trait characteristics, and their health criteria. That
And
was
were you trying to
provided to me.
match your physical characteristics or just characteristics that you thought, okay, this would work maybe with my husband's looks or
I thought mine,
okay.
like I thought if we had a child, in my head, what would they look like? I'm not gonna lie, the donor I chose, one of the things that really like sent me over the edge is that she said her great grandfather was played on the New York Yankees team.
Sports
And
scholarship. Here we come.
I mean, I'm from that area. The New York Yankees is the baseball team I grew up on. So I was like, he's a Yankee. So,
Everyone's got to have a criteria.
but one of the reasons I bring that up is because further down the road, when I have a good friend of mine who went through the donor process also, and she complained that she couldn't find a donor that didn't have her dimples. And I'm like, let it go. Let it
Mm.
go. Like at some point, you have to let go of some of those things, and you just have to look at the really important stuff. So on egg donor round 2 in San Diego, I really looked at health. Health was
Mm.
it. It was like what like the psychological testing and the health testing, like the blood work. And the other big thing is if they have gone through the process before, the egg donor process before, and if they've
Oh,
had
really?
success. And that is a big criteria. And I'm sorry I didn't mention this first. If you are dealing with an egg donor, whether it's through the clinic, which I highly recommend egg donor programs through the clinic versus subcontracted ones.
Mm.
But whether you're dealing with a subcontractor or through the clinic, you need to see the stats of that egg donor. Have they done it before? How successful were they? How many embryos did they produce? How many children came out of that production? Because embryos are great, but the number of eggs are great. But then you have to see how many of those went to fruition to embryos, and then how many of those went to fruition to a child.
So that's something I didn't think about is that an egg donor may often donate multiple eggs over time. Like to me, it was just like, oh, I've donated one egg, one and done, and that's something that I've done. But so is it common that there are a lot of women they'll donate multiple times
Yes,
that you found?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. And you want if the clinic and or the subcontracting firm that you're working with, that the clinic is working with, if they're willing to provide that information, you want it. It's not common, which is why I chose the San Diego clinic because they are
Mm,
completely transparent and their donor eggs are in-house. Like their donor program is in-house. They don't subcontract out.
got it. And then did you have a chance to meet the donor or is it all just paper
It's
and
all
that's it?
anonymous. It's
Yeah.
all anonymous. However, I will also say, and this is also rare, the San Diego Clinic's egg donor program provides adult pictures of the donor. That's unusual. Most provide just baby pictures for
Oh, I didn't know
privacy
that.
reasons. Yeah. I didn't know
Yeah.
that either. I mean, I knew it because a friend of mine is the one who recommended San Diego to me in the beginning. But at that point, I had put that on the list of 7 different programs I had interviewed throughout the country. I just
Oh,
happened to
wow.
fall on San Diego. But yeah, that's not common to get adult pictures of the donor.
Okay. And at this point, you've done 6 rounds of in vitro and you've done the frozen egg donor. You don't have to give the exact number, but kind of what's a ballpark figure that you're spending to do this that people might either be curious about because they're looking at it that way or just to
Okay,
know.
so are you talking about all or just the egg donor at that time?
Between all of the in vitro processes and the
Okay.
frozen egg donor.
So we're talking, my daughter will be 8 at the end of
Uh-huh.
May. So this is 8 years ago. It was probably about, let's just say 15 grand per IVF cycle. It was 25 grand for that frozen egg donor.
Oh, wow.
So 15 times 6 and then 25. I'm not really, you all are the math people now.
Right. A lot. It's a lot. And then
And that
how
doesn't
between you
that
and
doesn't include drugs. That doesn't
right.
include, yeah.
Wow. And so how did you and your husband get to the point where you're like, okay, we're willing to spend this much money? Because I know that's a big deal, especially for a lot of people when they may not have the resources to do it and they decide, okay, but it's really important to us. How did you guys come to that conclusion? We're willing to do whatever to X amount, or was it whatever it takes, or how did that work
Um,
out between you guys?
well, we set our red line in the sand as if we had to sell our house. That
Mm,
was kind of like the red line for us. Um, my now ex-husband cashed out some of his 401k. Um, I do remember his first job had a certain amount set aside for in vitro, but not the drugs. So
okay.
that was about a $20,000 relief.
Wow. Oh, that's cool.
I know that was like yeah, that was unheard of. So we got at least lucky with that. Um, I think that's about it. I mean,
Yeah.
it was really the red line was selling our house.
Yeah. And if anything before that, it was we're doing whatever it takes.
It was, and we talked about other people were asked us a lot, like, why don't you adopt? Why don't you look into that? So there was a lot of those conversations. Adoption is not that much cheaper, but honestly, the truth of the matter with us, just us specifically, is that uh, a, a red line for my now ex husband was he just said absolutely zero no to adoption. So
Okay.
that was kind of like it wasn't even on the table.
Okay.
So
Yeah, and these are conversations that you have to have that are important because it is two of you guys coming together to make this decision and to live down the line. Okay, so you get to the fresh donor and you found one that has good track record
good
and
track
has good
record.
health, all that stuff. So what's next now?
So we went out there and we did. So that's where Jen comes in. So, um, so I said to my now ex husband, I'm sorry I keep referring to him that way. I don't know any other way to refer to him.
Just say my ex.
Yeah, my ex. I said to him, now that because I interviewed like 7 clinics across the country, including one in Italy,
Oh,
and
wow.
well, they had a very unique like in vitro procedure that they were trying to get approved, but that's a different story. So I chose San Diego, and I said to my ex, I went to college out there, and my roommate that I lived with for basically 3 years. It really I only lived with him for 2 years, but he dated my freshman roommate that I was randomly matched with. So he was always in our dorm room, always. And it's a good thing I liked him. He was I was like, otherwise he would like I'm like, this is a very small space. No, but I liked him enough that the 3 of us ended up living together for the next 2 years, sophomore year and junior year. And actually we had a fourth roommate our sophomore year. But anyway, the point is that his name is Courtney, and that's Jen's husband. And
Hey.
so So when I said to my ex, we're going out to California, I haven't seen Courtney since we walked in graduation. I invited him to our wedding, but he couldn't make it.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, I haven't, he's now married. I've never met his wife, and he has two boys. I've never met their kids. So I want to see them when we're there. And my ex was like, oh, yeah, of course. So we met them when we were out there for the sixth cycle. That fresh egg donor process went really beautifully. We didn't get nearly the number of embryos that I wanted,
Mm,
but they were enough
right.
to work with. Um, that cycle failed. That was the seventh cycle. The
Mm.
eighth cycle failed. And then we saw them again when we went out for that cycle. And then it was after that that the surrogacy conversation came up.
Okay, so now I want to switch to Jen. Jen.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a woman that your husband has some history with, is has known her for a while, but
Mhm.
not really in each other's lives. And then you meet twice, and suddenly you're like, "Use my body." How does that happen? How did you get there?
I don't know. so so just to go back to that first time we met, Lauren and her ex, I had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old. So I was fresh with two little ones at the same time and met Lauren. She and I, and on the way over to meet them, I remember my husband saying, I think you two will get along just fine. And we hit it off and exchanged numbers. And I said, let me know how this cycle goes. And we communicated, off and on for the next couple of months. And then when they came back out, I think it was May the next year, you came out for the other cycle, the 8th cycle. And at that point, I had a scare in my family. My sister was actually going through IVF at the time. And we were worried about breast cancer popping up once the med, when you take all the estrogen and the meds and everything, it can sometimes make that happen. So I had said, well, I'll carry your babies if that's what's necessary. And my husband was like, yeah, that's totally fine. No big deal, right? And I mentioned it to Lauren one day and she said, don't say that to me if you don't mean it. I remember that. Remember that, Lauren? And I was like, I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. And she's like, well, okay, let's talk more about that.
Was that Mother's Day weekend?
I think it was actually.
Yeah,
It was in May. Yeah. And so we had that conversation and one thing led to another. Next thing you know, we're drafting contracts and figuring out the legality of the situation. And my husband and I, we went through they required psych evaluation for being a surrogate and
What's
talking
that
about
like?
It's just making sure that you're not, going to have issues with the whole surrogacy process and understanding that this child is not yours. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because, you and I were talking about when people see you as a surrogate, they're like, oh, I could never give up the baby. And it's like, well, it's not mine. So I can't keep it. It's legally, I can't keep it. So making sure that people understand that. And then also what was key for us was making sure that we understood that we needed to communicate with our children that this baby is not staying with us. It's going with its parents and moving away. And you are staying with us. We are your parents. So
did your kids have any question about that? Like, did they ever seem confused about it at all? Because they were pretty young.
They were 1 and 3. So they didn't, my 3-year-old, he had some questions, but they were very, basic. And I think as they got older, they had after, can we say her name, Lauren? Can we?
Can you say what?
Yeah.
Okay. So
you can say whatever you need to say.
Yeah. So after Anime was born,
Oh,
and left to go live with her parents, I think then he was kind of like, oh, the baby's gone. And he didn't really notice it too much. And then later on in life, he did have a couple more questions, like years later, but he remembers my 1-year-old. He didn't remember.
yeah. Too young.
But it was his birthday weekend, and the doctor was like, okay, well, you need to stop breastfeeding so that we could start the med. So it went from Mother's Day, mid-May, to end of May, 2 weeks later, and all of a sudden I'm off breastfeeding and I'm starting the meds and we're starting the process. So it went pretty quickly once we decided we were going to give it a go.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, question. If it hadn't have been someone that you and your husband knew, do you think he would have been as open to it as well as, say it's not your sister or it's not Lauren, who he's known for a long time? Would he have been open to you being a surrogate? Or do you think it had more to do with the fact that this is my friend and yeah, we can help?
I think it was between the two options. I think it was, because we know this person. Otherwise, I wasn't looking to like go out and be a surrogate because I wasn't interested in doing that necessarily. Like, because a lot of people, they do that. That's their income. They do it all the time. They pop kids out every year, and that's fine. That's for them. That's great because they're providing. I hate to say a service, but that's what it is, and allowing people to be a family and have children and have those experiences that some women just naturally cannot do. So I don't think I would have done it otherwise had it not been the case that Lauren and I just kind of clicked so easily. And I just, we had, I used to joke with Lauren, she would send me these essays almost on a daily basis through text message. I'd wake up, because she's 3 hours ahead of me, and I'd wake up and there would be, the morning text message from Lauren. So it was... It was fun. We had a lot to talk about. We definitely were kindred spirits, and I think that the whole process, even if I hadn't done it, I think we still would have become friends. So,
oh yeah, there's no question there. Yeah. And I will say too, just to follow up on the like from my end of this, when it comes to surrogacy, when I got that phone, when I had the phone consult with their follow-up consult with my doctor on the 8th failed IVF cycle, it was Friday of Mother's Day weekend, and I'll never forget it because we were packing up to go down to visit my parents to celebrate Mother's Day with them. And he said, you're looking at this point, you're down to 3 embryos, and they're perfect. No, I think we were down to 2. I'm sorry. I think we were down to 2.
No, we had 3.
We had 3?
Yeah.
Okay. You're down to 3 embryos. You're looking at a perfect uterus or perfect embryos. And the fact that your uterus has failed twice now, it's now your uterus. You need a surrogate. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, and that's one thing I will say that my ex would always say, that and I will say this to everyone who's listening, infertility is the Wild West of medicine. It's just, you're shooting in the dark, trying to solve a problem, and then you solve one problem and then another one pops up. It's very unpredictable. Prepare yourself for a roller coaster ride of every possible, like anything you can think of under the sun. And I always told myself, I will never say no until I'm faced with it. Like there's even though my ex was a hard no on adoption, I never closed that door. Even now, I'm thinking about adoption. Sorry, Jen, I didn't break that to you yet, but
hey,
no, I'm not here first. I mean, I'm thinking about it. I'm not like, but and so I will just say that like that weekend was a huge weekend, and I went home. I went down to South Florida,
and on Mother's Day of all days.
Yeah, of course, I know, right? The irony. Oh, and then my doctor said you need to get a surrogate, and he gave me the numbers of 2 surrogacy agencies. And again, Florida or California being 3 hours behind, I still had time to call. It was Friday. I'm like, so I get on the phone, I call, and I get quotes from them, and the cheaper one was $110,000. 8 years ago. This was 8 years ago again.
Yep.
Wow.
And that was just for the surrogate. That didn't include drugs, the cycle fees. That was just for the surrogate.
Wow.
And like the agency fees, and they had a like clothing stipend and food stipend, and I think there was even
insurance.
Surrogacy insurance. Surrogacy insurance back then, the policies were like 45,000.
Wow.
So you can't just, somebody has to have surrogacy insurance. It doesn't, you don't have that insurance as carrying your own child. So even if you
Yeah.
have mass medical insurance, it's the surrogate who needs the insurance, not you.
Right. Yeah.
So, so I was like, oh, we're done. So I just remember that specifically, and then talking to Jen that night about it. And so, yeah, it was a very fast process because it's not just the surrogacy insurance, it's also then the legal fees. So each party involved has to have a lawyer representing them. And usually the intended parent or parents have to pay for both those lawyer fees.
Oh,
So,
wow.
right,
Yeah,
Jen?
I
Isn't that
see.
the case?
Hmm.
I think
Yeah,
so. Yeah.
so, but yet their lawyer represented them independently, but we paid, for all those fees. And then Jen and I, the contract involved, I'll never forget that process. That was an interesting process
Yeah.
because you have to think of
Okay, so you got to tell that.
well, and I'll let Jen also talk about this on her side, but from my side, it was like you have to think of every scenario under the sun that could go wrong during the pregnancy or the birth. And how do you handle that? There's also life insurance. We took out a life insurance policy on Jen in case she died while giving
Hmm.
birth. What would Courtney get, her husband?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to use his name, Jen. I didn't mean to.
We already did. It's fine. It's still fine.
Um, so, there's just a lot of moving parts is my point. And so
Yeah.
so when she says that I would send these epic texts, a
Epic.
lot of them had to do with that.
Like,
I
okay,
would
point
dreams.
1,
Like,
point 10A.
how do you feel if this happened or that happened? And there were just a lot of conversations we had.
Yeah.
Was it ever awkward to ask those questions? Like, did you ever start typing and you're like, oh, I hate to ask this, but I have to ask it? Or was it just like, okay, here's the deal. This is what we got to go through?
I'll let Jen answer that. I don't know.
Well, from the asking of the questions, I mean, that was mostly on Lauren. I think I asked a couple of questions, but I think if you knew the relationship that Lauren and I have, you know that it's pretty raw. So we're just straight up honest with each other on stuff. And well, going through that whole process, I mean, how could you not be? Right. But I think there were a couple of questions that came up, like, if there's something wrong with the fetus and you need to terminate, that question we did have to tiptoe around that one a little bit, but we both dove right into it and just said, this is what we're going to do if that happens. And then, of course, having to involve, both intended parents. It wasn't just myself and Lauren having the conversations. I remember emails going back and forth between the three of us regarding, the potential termination, what would happen there. What was the other? There was another one. It was on the tip of my tongue that we had to go back and forth on, because if both parties don't agree, then it has to default to one. And California law for surrogacy is kind of wonky versus, because it's where the child will be born, not where it will live. So everything had to be based on, and each county was a little different. So I remember I actually had to drive, my husband and I had to drive. We had to drive from San Diego County to Marietta County to have it notarized and filed in that county. I can't remember exactly what it was, but because of the way that they file it there, it was a lot quicker, and something was better about Marietta County versus San Diego.
Like they're a little bit more lax or something.
Yeah, and we had to get a babysitter, and it was this whole thing.
Not the babysitter.
But yeah, so I mean, but going through the whole contract part, I think was good because we had to hash out some of that information because, I know what I was going to say. This was during the Zika virus scare, if you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
I remember.
We had to do an addendum to the contract to account for Zika virus precautions. And Lauren and her husband sent me a care package that was full of Avon,
I did
Skin So Soft.
Yeah, it was all it. But you know what? I love the Skin So Soft Avon. That stuff was great, but it smelled wonderful. But yeah, it was in the contract that I had to wear mosquito repellent during my pregnancy for fear of Zika virus. So that
Wow.
was
Well, at
just
least you didn't have to stay indoors all the time.
well, this is true. This is true.
Yeah.
But it was
Wow.
just, there were little things in the contract that, we had to hash out, but it all worked out. We didn't have any issues.
I will say that in the very beginning of from my recollection, and maybe Jen can correct me if I'm wrong because my memory might be different, but I just remember us when we first decided, okay, we're doing this, or we're going to try and do it. That I remember us saying to each other, let's just try and keep the men out as much as possible. Because
Yeah.
it's like that idea of like you have too many heads in the kitchen. It's like, it just complicates matters. So I think a lot of this took place between the two of us.
Yes, it did.
And I'm not, and I would then give my ex the short version because the Zika thing, he was just like, that was something that he latched onto. That was a big deal
Yeah,
to
that
him.
was
And I'm
good.
like, you're totally, I mean, he did something similar when we went to visit them and he saw her drinking a Coke, like a can of Coke. And with the caffeine, he goes, I don't think she should be drinking caffeine. I'm like, could we pick our battles?
Right?
Like this is a very small.
Yeah. I
Um.
think it'll be okay.
Yeah. So it's
And
like,
isn't it funny though? Because if it had been your baby and you'd been carrying it, would he have given you a hard time about drinking Coke?
oh yeah,
You'd be like,
yeah.
I'm craving, dude.
But I mean, I'm just saying, as if you're going to go through this process, you have to be prepared, because in the end, I mean, the honest truth is, the men in these situations, unfortunately, don't have a lot of control.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going through the women.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, as much as I would love to blame him for this, I give him that benefit of the doubt that it's like, you're not only do they have very little control, but they're like, we're also dealing with 3,000 miles between us.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not like we didn't do like a daily update. It wasn't like she sent us a daily, like summary of the day, or which would have been like a nightmare for her, I think, if we would have demanded that like that. So I'm just saying, like, for all parties involved, you have to kind of account for personality types. How are they going to handle it going through it? One of the funny, Jen, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but one of the funniest things that your husband said was when one of his coworkers noticed that you were pregnant, and he was like, I don't know if it was he or she, but the coworker said, I didn't know your wife was pregnant. And he was like, oh yeah, but don't worry, it's not mine.
We did
So
that a couple of times.
you have to account for the personality types that are going into something like this, and can they handle it? And it's definitely a journey and a learning experience, I would say. And Jen mentioned the boys. Like, some of my favorite pictures is when she would send them and they would be holding her belly,
Oh,
and
yeah.
like the progress, and then they came to the hotel room and they held her. We have pictures of them holding her.
Oh, that's
And
sweet.
so there's so many, I think, more positive moments of this process than, I don't think there were any negatives, in my opinion. It was more about like the stresses along the
Yeah.
way.
Okay, so speaking of the guys, and I know Jen and I had this conversation because Jen, something had to stop happening for you and your husband.
Right.
And how did that affect, and I'll let you get into that, but kind of how was the overall process within your relationship? And then, Lauren, I would love to hear what this whole process was on your relationship, because I can only imagine the stress of, first of all, disappointment, and second of all, the finances and the roller coaster and all that. And then, all the changes in your family as well. So I would love to hear about that.
Okay, so you want me to start with the what had to
Oh,
stop?
oh yeah.
Well, as a surrogate, you wind up going through I don't know if it's exact same, but as far as the meds are concerned, I actually found an old video on my phone the other day of me starting my Lupron injections. So you go through a lot of the same medical procedures that, as if because the baby is the fetus is going inside of my uterus. So they're not stimulating necessary the follicles to produce eggs, but they still want to soften the uterus, make it happy place for the fetus to implant, the embryo to implant. So, I'm taking fertility drugs basically. And so they tell you, hey, while you're on these meds, no sexy time. Because the worst thing to happen would be I get pregnant by my husband while on their dime. And that would be awful. So I think there was even something in the contract, like I would owe them. I think I owe them money. I think, Lauren, was that it? Like if I get pregnant,
gosh,
I can't remember.
I honestly didn't even think about that, and I probably just glossed it over in the contract. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was there.
Yeah, I think it was. And my husband was like,
"That's crazy.
Wait, what?" I'm like, yeah.
wait.
In hindsight, that's crazy. If I would have seen that and but I mean, it makes sense. But at the same time,
yeah.
And but that wasn't for the whole pregnancy. It was just for a certain period of time, right?
Well, and that goes up until the procedure to transfer the embryos, and then for I think it was 8 weeks or something after.
Oh wow!
To make sure that the embryo, you don't want any uterine contractions that could inject the embryo. So so they were like up until transfer, and then like 2 months after or something like that. So it was definitely interesting, to say the least.
Okay, so I'm going to, just because you said that, I'm going to ask the TMI question, but because we have all been in the same boat, after they inserted the embryo into you, I know they gave me a sheet. They're like, don't worry about this, but the first time you go to the bathroom and it's not pee, you're like, can I push? Did that happen to you guys? Did you get nervous at all ever?
Yeah.
Well, Lauren, go, you start.
Yeah. No, I definitely did.
Yeah. Something you don't expect, for sure. But then you're like, whoa, wait a second. What if it comes out? Yeah.
Well, and then I also, Lauren, you remember the scare that we had? They took, we said 3 embryos. I think you had 4. So they thought out 3.
I did. You're right. We had 8 total, and we did 2 and 2 with me, and then we had we had the 4.
So they thought out 3 the morning of the procedure. One of them didn't make it, and so they had 2 left.
That's another thing you have to think about is the thaw. They don't always make it.
You might lose one.
Mm-hmm. So you should always assume you're going to lose one.
Yeah. So they thawed 3. 1 didn't make it, and so they transferred 2 into me. Now they didn't tell us that they thawed 3 and 1 didn't make it, and there was 1 left, because that might have changed the equation a little bit. But they did put 2 in. And what wound up happening was, the 1 embryo attached. And I think I was telling you, Mitch, I felt it. I could feel it. And I knew it had happened. I was like, oh, there it is. And the second one apparently attached right after and right next to where the first one attached. And so I think it was about 2 weeks later, I was laying on the couch getting ready for bed, and all of a sudden I felt pressure and just ran to the bathroom, and I was bleeding horrifically and realized what was happening. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to call Lauren in the morning and let her know. And I was freaking out. Wound up going to the doctor the next day, and even though it was about a week too early, they wound up getting a heartbeat on the embryo that was there. So even though we were a week, we cheated it a little bit. We were supposed to wait till I think 6 weeks. And we got there a week early, and they were able to find a heartbeat, and they said yes.
I didn't know that. I'm sorry. I didn't know that.
So I might have waited that for you. I might have just waited until I had confirmation. Don't make me cry. I know,
I'm going to cry too.
Until I had confirmation, because I was like, having had 2 live births, I knew and they tell you in all the books, if you're having a miscarriage in your first 12 weeks, first trimester, there's nothing they can do to stop it. Not a darn thing. And I thought, if I'm miscarrying, I'm just I don't know what I'm going to do and what I'm going to tell her. So I went to the doctor the next day, and they found the heartbeat, and I think I just cried in the car, because I was like, oh my God. So I can't remember exactly what it's called, but basically the second embryo it formed, and it was just a ball of cells, basically. And at some point, it wasn't going to become a fetus, and it just expelled those cells. So that was what happened. It basically was a self-abortion of a non-fetus, if that's what you want to call it.
It was a miscarriage. Yeah.
It was, yeah. And so, but the other one was right there next to it. And he said there was a tear from where the miscarriage occurred, and it was right next to where Anime had implanted.
We were worried about it. I said we were worried about it because
so we had to I was on bed rest for I think 2 weeks until that kind of healed up, and then everything was fine. And they're like, okay, well, you can go back to your regular activities. That's healed up, because they were worried if that tear expanded, then I would miscarry her as well. So they had to make sure that everything was good. But after that, I mean, I just remember the whole pregnancy being pretty routine. There was nothing that really, I mean, the usual issues that people go through IVF get with the placenta. And Mitch, I don't know if you had any of those, but the previa, what was the placental cord insertion issue?
Yeah, that doesn't insert in the right way or doesn't attach.
Yeah, where the placenta and the umbilical are supposed to attach, like this is the placenta and it attaches in the middle, but her cord attached on the end, which meant she was getting lower blood flow. So I had to go back in for more exams on that, and she was fine. And then I wound up with gestational diabetes, so that was fun. So then she was going to be big, and I'm like, well, what anything from
what's
small
big?
Baby. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
she was a small baby, you said?
No, gosh, no.
Oh, she was big.
No, she was 9'2".
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
She's a big girl.
And a week early. Yeah. So
yeah, and a week early. That's right.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Did they induce you because it was in vitro?
Nope.
No.
One thing, my body's very efficient at delivering children. My water breaks and it just comes out.
That's actually an interesting question, because our contract didn't say anything that I recall. It didn't say anything about, like, I'm sure it did somewhere, but I don't remember it saying anything where, like, they have to be induced or they go to, natural birth, or even, because Jen was adamant about no epidural.
Right.
And I don't think there was anything in the contract about any of that either.
No, there was no birth plan in there. No.
Yeah, there was no birth plan. Thank you. Yeah. There was, so like, as a first time person going through surrogacy, it never occurred to me to even ask about those things.
Right.
And I'm kind of glad, because I feel like if we had that on the radar, I'm pretty flexible about this stuff, but I feel like my ex might have been more like it has to be in the hospital and it has to be, so that's something else to consider too.
Yeah. And I think we were, I don't remember having the conversation, again, this was 8 years ago, that I had already had both of my boys naturally and without medication. So I had said, well, if I can do that for Anime, I will. But I was always of the mindset that it depends on the situation when I get to the hospital, because if there's an emergency, I would never let it get to a point where I would put my life or the life of the child in danger. If the doctor says, no, we need to do a C-section and we need to do it now, fine, let's do it. So it was always kind of like at the doctor's recommendation. But our hospital in San Diego was great. I delivered both the boys there, and they never pushed anything. They'd ask you at triage, like, do you want medication? And if you said no, they're like, okay, we won't ask again until it's necessary. So they were great about that. And I think because of how fast the delivery was, there was no time for me to even have the doctor in there to give me drugs. So, yeah.
Oh my gosh, talk about a roller coaster ride. I know when I heard that what these two were willing to go through to get to the child on the other side, I understand struggle and sacrifice at a whole new level. And this is just the beginning. Wait until the next time when we find out about what happens once this baby is finally born and how it almost ended one family's way of life. You're not going to want to miss this. So with that, thank you for joining us. I can't wait until next week. Make it rich, make it fun, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.